Have you ever noticed how often we chase after comfort? A warm cup of coffee when the morning feels too heavy, a quiet walk when the world gets too loud, a few days off when our bones ache from the weight of expectations. We call it self-care. These little escapes have become the modern anthem for well-being. Spa days, scented candles, digital detox weekends. And while there's nothing wrong with a hot bath or a good book, there's something deeper we've been missing. Because what happens when the bathwater cools, when the weekend ends, when the world presses its full weight against your chest again on a Monday morning? That's where Buddhist wisdom offers something rare, something most of us have forgotten. You see, according to the Buddha, true self-care isn't about pampering the body or seeking temporary pleasure. It's about waking up, not to the noise around you, but to the noise inside you. The worries, the insecurities, the endless craving to feel okay. Buddhist teachings reveal a truth most of us would rather avoid, that suffering isn't an accident. It's not a flaw in your life's design. It's built into existence itself. But don't mistake this for pessimism. In fact, it's the first and most compassionate step toward real peace. Because when you finally stop running from discomfort, when you stop trying to numb, avoid, or outsmart your own pain, something extraordinary happens. You start to see it clearly, and what you can see, you can heal. In Buddhist thought, the greatest act of self-love isn't escaping suffering, it's understanding it. Not rejecting the hard days, but embracing them as teachers. Not chasing after what makes you feel good, but gently asking, why do I feel I need this to be happy? This is where the practice of self-care transforms from surface-level indulgence into something sacred. It becomes the art of tending to your mind, your heart, and your soul with wisdom. Buddha taught that the root of suffering lies in craving, our desperate, restless hunger for things to be different than they are. We crave praise over criticism, security over uncertainty, youth over aging, pleasure over discomfort. And the more we cling to these preferences, the more we suffer. Because life, by its very nature, will never meet all of those demands. The body ages. Relationships shift. Success fades. People leave. And seasons turn. True self-care, then, isn't about arranging your world so you never feel pain. It's about cultivating a mind that remains steady in the middle of it. A heart that can hold both joy and sorrow without collapsing. A spirit unshaken by the passing winds of fortune. Imagine for a moment, what if you could carry peace not as a visitor, but as a constant companion? What if serenity didn't depend on your circumstances, but blossomed from your ability to be fully present with whatever arose? This is the promise of Buddhist wisdom, and it starts, not with some grand enlightenment on a mountaintop, but in the quiet moments you've always overlooked. The breath you're taking right now, the thought you didn't notice just crossed your mind, the ache in your chest when you remember something lost. Buddhism invites us to turn toward these ordinary, often uncomfortable experiences with awareness. Not to judge, not to fix, but simply to see. Because the truth is, most of our suffering doesn't come from the pain itself, it comes from our resistance to it, from the stories we tell about it, from the belief that it shouldn't be happening to us. But when you release that resistance, when you sit still long enough to feel the rise and fall of your own restlessness, without trying to escape, you find something astonishing. Peace isn't somewhere else. It's right here, underneath the noise, inside the very discomfort you've spent a lifetime avoiding. And so, self-care becomes less about adding things to your life and more about subtracting. Letting go of the need to be perfect, releasing the endless comparisons, dropping the exhausting performance of always being fine. It's about making space. Space to breathe. Space to feel. Space to remember who you were before the world told you who you should be. In the Buddhist path, this journey inward isn't selfish. In fact, it's the most generous thing you can do. Because when you care for your own mind with clarity and compassion, you stop bleeding your suffering onto others. You show up kinder, steadier, less reactive. You offer the world the rarest kind of presence, a heart undisturbed by its storms. And isn't that what we're all quietly craving? Not just to feel better, but to be better, not to escape life, but to finally belong to it. So as we begin this exploration together, consider this. True self-care isn't about fixing yourself because you're broken. It's about realizing you were never broken to begin with. You were only asleep, and every moment of mindfulness is a small awakening. A soft return to what has always been here, waiting. Yourself, whole, wild, tender, and enough. Let's begin with a question most of us have never asked out loud. Who am I really? Not the name you answer to, not the job you perform, not the roles you play, parent, partner, student, success story, or cautionary tale. But beneath all of that, who's there? For most of us, the answer feels slippery. Because from the moment we're old enough to understand language, the world hands us labels. And we spend the rest of our lives wearing them like a second skin. I'm smart, I'm unlovable, I'm a winner, I'm a failure. We build a self-image out of fragments, opinions, memories, victories, wounds. And soon, this collection of ideas begins to feel like me. But Buddhism gently, and sometimes shockingly, pulls the curtain back on this illusion. The Buddha taught a radical truth called Anatta, often translated as non-self. It means there's no fixed, permanent, unchanging identity behind your thoughts and emotions. No little driver sitting at the controls inside your head. What you think of as you is more like a river, ever shifting, never holding the same shape for long. A stream of sensations, moods, beliefs, and perceptions flowing through each moment. Pause for a second and watch. That thought you just had, where did it come from? Did you choose it? Or did it appear uninvited like a bird landing on a branch? Notice how your emotions rise and fall like weather. Anger flares, then cools. Joy blooms, then fades. Fear tightens, then releases. Yet through all of this, we cling to the idea of a stable, separate self. A me that owns these feelings, controls these thoughts, directs this life. But if you look closely, and Buddhism invites you to do just that, you'll find something astonishing. There's no one home, no solid core, just a series of interconnected processes arising and dissolving. Now, this might sound unsettling at first. If there's no fixed me, then who's living this life? Who's watching these thoughts, feeling these feelings? But here's where the wisdom unfolds like a lotus in the mud. The realization of Anatta isn't nihilism, it's liberation. Because what causes so much of our suffering isn't life itself. It's our desperate attempt to defend this fictional identity. We crave praise because it makes our ego feel inflated. We fear criticism because it threatens our sense of self. We chase success, validation, control, all in service of maintaining an image we believe is us. But if there's no permanent self to protect, what's left to fear? If you're not the anger, nor the anxiety, nor the fleeting desire, you become free to witness them without being consumed. And in that witnessing, peace begins to root itself. Buddhist practice isn't about erasing your personality or becoming a blank slate. It's about seeing through the illusions that bind you, to recognize that you are not the stories you've been telling yourself. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack for years, believing it was part of your body, and then one day, someone shows you how to take it off. The lightness you'd feel, the strange, exhilarating freedom, that's what glimpsing Anatta feels like. In meditation, you begin to watch your mind instead of getting swept away by it. You notice the way a memory triggers a chain of emotions, the way a craving rises and falls, the way your identity tries to latch onto every experience as evidence of who you are. And slowly, a new space opens up, a space where thoughts are just thoughts, feelings are just feelings, and you, the witnessing awareness, are untouched. This isn't detachment in the cold, numb sense. It's an intimacy with life so raw and honest, it no longer needs to be filtered through ego. The sunset doesn't need to impress you. The grief doesn't need to be pushed away. Each moment can arise in its fullness, because you're no longer demanding it serve your story. This is where true self-care deepens. Because when you stop clinging to the illusion of a fixed self, you stop needing the world to constantly affirm it. You become softer, less defensive, more curious, more compassionate both toward yourself and others. After all, if the person who cut you off in traffic isn't a solid, unchanging villain, but rather a temporary swirl of emotions and circumstances, how much easier it becomes to forgive. And if your own fear or sadness isn't you, but a passing storm, how much easier it becomes to be gentle with yourself. Anatta isn't a belief you adopt. It's a truth you discover, little by little, in the quiet places of your own awareness. And once you've glimpsed it, even for a moment, you realize how much of your suffering was optional, how much of your anxiety came from chasing after a self that was never solid to begin with. And in that understanding, there's room for a kind of peace you may have never known before, a peace that doesn't depend on praise or control or certainty, a peace that simply is. Stay here with this thought a little longer. Let it echo inside you. Because as we move deeper, we'll begin to explore what happens when you stop chasing and start being. Let's pause here for a moment. You might be wondering, if there's no solid, unchanging self, and if what we call me is just a flow of passing thoughts, feelings, and sensations, then why do we suffer so much? Why does life so often feel heavy, tangled, restless? Buddhism answers this question not with abstract philosophy, but with a profound and deeply compassionate diagnosis of the human condition. And it begins with a single word, dukkha. Now, dukkha is often translated as suffering, but its meaning is more textured than that. It speaks of the persistent dissatisfaction woven into the fabric of ordinary existence, not just the sharp pain of heartbreak or illness, but the subtle unease beneath even our happiest moments, the gnawing sense that things could be better, should be different, or might slip away. Have you felt it? That little emptiness the moment after a celebration ends. The way a long-awaited achievement tastes sweet for a moment, then fades. The anxiety beneath the surface of a quiet day as your mind reaches for the next distraction. This is dukkha, the restless discontent that haunts us, not because life is cruel, but because of how our minds relate to life. The Buddha, like a physician diagnosing a chronic illness, identified this ancient affliction, and then, in an act of luminous wisdom, offered a clear path toward healing. He called them the Four Noble Truths, not as commandments, but as observations anyone willing to look closely could verify in their own heart. The first noble truth there is dukkha. Life contains suffering, dissatisfaction. No one escapes it, not the wealthy, not the wise, not the innocent. It's not a pessimistic declaration, it's a call to honesty. To admit that no matter how carefully we arrange our lives, discomfort finds its way in. Loss, illness, aging, separation, anxiety, they visit us all. But here's the turning point. The second noble truth, dukkha has causes. It isn't random or cruel. It arises because of certain conditions, chiefly our craving, aversion, and ignorance. We suffer because we crave what we don't have. We suffer because we cling to what we fear losing. We suffer because we push away what we dislike, rather than making peace with its presence. And we suffer most deeply because we misunderstand the nature of this life, chasing permanence in a world built on impermanence. The third noble truth, there's a way out. Suffering isn't inevitable. It's not your life sentence. It's a condition that can be eased and eventually transcended through wisdom, mindfulness, and compassionate living. And finally, the fourth noble truth, the path that leads to the end of dukkha. Known as the Noble Eightfold Path, it's not a doctrine to memorize but a practice to embody. A way of living in the world that untangles the knots of craving and delusion. It speaks of right view, seeing life as it truly is, not as we wish it to be. Right intention, nurturing kindness and letting go of ill will. Right speech, using words that heal, not harm. Right action, living with integrity and compassion. Right livelihood, earning a living in ways that don't perpetuate suffering. Right effort, cultivating wholesome states of mind, releasing the unwholesome. Right mindfulness, staying present with what is, here and now. Right concentration, training the mind to rest in stillness and clarity. This path isn't a punishment. It's not about denying yourself joy or retreating from the world. It's about caring for your own mind with wisdom, tending to it like a garden, pulling the weeds of craving, planting the seeds of kindness, watering them with steady awareness. Because here's a secret many never learn. The mind left unattended creates its own suffering. It spins stories of lack, fear, envy, regret. It clings and pushes, chasing ghosts and fantasies. But a mind cared for becomes a refuge, a source of resilience, a wellspring of quiet joy. Imagine waking up and no longer being a prisoner of every passing thought, no longer enslaved by the approval of others, no longer chasing the next shiny promise of fulfillment. Imagine meeting life exactly as it is with grace, not because everything's perfect, but because your heart is steady enough to hold both the sweetness and the sorrow without collapsing. That's the promise hidden within the Four Noble Truths. Not a world free from difficulty, but a heart free within it. And it begins, not with grand gestures, but with simple, gentle awareness. Noticing the craving before it becomes obsession. Noticing the aversion before it turns to hatred. Noticing the restlessness before it spins you into distraction. In those tiny moments of mindfulness, you reclaim your life. And so, as we move forward, let's deepen this understanding. Let's not only see the causes of our suffering, but learn how to untangle them, how to care for our own hearts in the most radical, beautiful way possible, by letting go. Because what you release stops controlling you. And in that spaciousness, peace isn't something you chase, it's something you become. Have you ever driven somewhere, arrived at your destination, and realized you remember nothing of the journey? Your hands were on the wheel, your eyes on the road, but your mind miles away, lost in worries, memories, to-do lists, or daydreams. It's a strange thing, isn't it, to be alive yet not truly present for your own life. And that right there is one of the quiet tragedies of modern living. We rush, we plan, we react. But we rarely pause to feel the texture of this moment, to notice the warmth of sunlight on our skin, the subtle rise and fall of our breath, the miracle of simply existing here and now. Buddhism calls this quality mindfulness, sati in the ancient Pali language, not a trendy practice or fleeting wellness hack, but the very heart of wise, compassionate living. It's the awareness that remembers to notice, to be here, fully, without clinging, without resistance, without distraction. And here's where it becomes the most profound act of self-care you could ever offer yourself. Because the root of so much of our suffering lies not in what's happening, but in our unexamined reactions to it. We're hurt, and without awareness we lash out. We're lonely, and without awareness we numb ourselves. We're anxious, and without awareness we chase endless distractions. But mindfulness is the light that lets you see. It creates space between stimulus and response. It softens the grip of old habits. And in that space, healing begins. You see, self-care isn't just about bubble baths and spa days. It's not something you schedule for Sunday afternoons. It's a way of relating to your own experience with tenderness and clarity. When you practice mindfulness, you start to notice the tightness in your chest before stress takes over, the way your jaw clenches when anger stirs, the quiet ache of loneliness you usually bury under endless scrolling. And in noticing, you reclaim the power to respond differently, to choose compassion over reactivity, patience over frustration, stillness over frenzy. The Buddha compared an untrained, unmindful mind to a wild, untamed elephant, powerful but dangerous, capable of causing great harm if left unchecked. But through mindfulness, that same mind becomes a wise companion, no longer your enemy, no longer a tyrant. It begins with something astonishingly simple: watching your breath, not forcing it, not judging it, just feeling it. The cool air entering your nostrils, the gentle rise of your chest, the warmth as you exhale. It anchors you to the present moment by moment. And here's the secret most people miss: you don't have to stop your thoughts. That's not the point. The mind will think, just as the heart beats and the lungs breathe. But you can learn to watch those thoughts without being pulled into them, like clouds passing through an open sky, like leaves floating down a stream. You might notice a thought of fear, and instead of spiraling into anxiety, simply note, fear. A flash of irritation is here. And gently return to your breath. This gentle awareness is radical self-care, because for perhaps the first time, you're meeting your own experience with kindness instead of judgment, with curiosity instead of control. The more you practice, the more you begin to see how much of your suffering is optional, how often you're caught in imaginary battles, fighting what isn't happening, or clinging to what has already passed. Mindfulness doesn't mean you stop feeling pain or sorrow or anger. It means you hold those experiences without drowning in them, without letting them define you. It creates space. And in that space, wisdom appears. You realize that nothing is permanent, not your joy, not your fear, not your story of who you are. And strangely, that truth is not frightening but liberating. Because if nothing is fixed, you are free to meet each moment as it is. Not through the lens of old wounds or future fears, but fresh, alive, awake. That is the power of awareness. It's why every great Buddhist master, from ancient forest monks to modern teachers, has pointed to mindfulness as the doorway to peace. Because when you're fully present, you realize you already have everything you need. You stop chasing and start arriving, not in some future moment, but here, in this breath, in this heartbeat, in this life. And so, as we continue on this journey, let's explore how this awareness can help us not only care for ourselves, but untangle the roots of craving and clinging that keep us bound. Because when mindfulness meets wisdom, it becomes more than self-care. It becomes freedom. There's a quiet kind of power in a single, sincere wish. May you be happy. May you be free from suffering. It seems simple enough. But in the world we live in, a world wired for comparison, competition, and endless self-judgment, offering yourself that same loving wish can feel almost rebellious. And yet, within the ancient wisdom of Buddhism, there lies a timeless teaching. Self-care without loving kindness is incomplete, because true healing isn't just about calming the mind. It's about softening the heart. In Buddhist practice, two radiant qualities guide this path, Metta and Karuna. They sound ancient because they are, but their message is timeless. Metta means loving kindness, a boundless, unconditional friendliness toward oneself and all beings. Not romantic love, not attachment, but a gentle, steady warmth of heart. Karuna is compassion, the trembling of the heart in response to suffering. It's that instinct that stirs when you see a child crying, a friend hurting, or even notice your own heart bruised by loneliness. Together, they form the emotional foundation of Buddhist self-care. You see, mindfulness without compassion can become cold. It can turn into mere observation, detached, clinical. But when awareness is infused with Metta and Karuna, something extraordinary happens. You start to meet your own pain, your own fears, your own insecurities with tenderness. And isn't that what we truly need most in our hardest moments? Not harsh self-criticism, not numb distraction, but a steady, kind presence. Imagine this. You notice a sharp wave of anxiety rise in your chest. In the past, maybe you tense up, push it away, or bury it under work or scrolling. But now you pause. You place a hand gently on your heart and softly whisper, "It's okay, dear one. This too belongs." That's Metta, a wish for your own well-being in the midst of discomfort. And as you sit with that anxious ache, you might notice a quiet sadness underneath. A memory, a fear, a longing. And your heart responds not with judgment but with Karuna. I see your pain, I'm here with you. This is self-care that goes beyond surface-level soothing. It's a radical act of befriending your whole experience. And here's where it transforms everything. When you learn to offer loving kindness and compassion to yourself, your capacity to offer it to others naturally grows. You begin to see the people around you not as competitors, obstacles, or strangers, but as fellow travelers, carrying their own unseen burdens. The angry driver in traffic, the irritable coworker, the silent person beside you in line. You realize they too want to be happy. They too long to be free from pain. They too are doing the best they can with the tools they have. And suddenly the world softens, not because it changed, but because you did. The Buddha once taught a beautiful practice known as Metta, the cultivation of loving kindness. It begins with yourself. You quietly repeat, "May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I be safe. May I live with ease." At first it might feel awkward. Your inner critic might roll its eyes, but gently, patiently, like watering a tender seed, you keep offering those words. And then you extend it outward, to a loved one, to a neutral person, to someone difficult, and finally to all beings everywhere. Not because it will fix the world, but because it will free your heart. This isn't about pretending bad things don't happen. It's not about toxic positivity. It's about cultivating the courage to meet reality with an open heart. Because here's what the ancient masters knew. A heart closed to its own suffering will struggle to hold the suffering of others. But a heart softened by loving kindness and compassion becomes vast, resilient, unbreakable. And you, exactly as you are, have that capacity. In this moment, in this breath, in this tender human life. And so, as we continue on this journey together, remember, self-care isn't selfish. It's the ground from which all genuine care for others grows. Metta is the warmth that allows you to rest. Karuna is the hand you offer to your own sorrow. Together, they turn self-care into a sacred daily practice. And as you wake tomorrow, before you check your phone, before the rush of tasks and noise, pause, place your hand on your heart, and silently wish yourself well, because you are worthy of kindness, not someday, not when you're perfect, but now. And from this place of compassion, let's explore what it truly means to release the cravings and attachments that keep us bound and discover a deeper kind of peace. There's a quiet, ancient truth that echoes through every corner of existence. A truth so simple, yet so easily forgotten, everything changes. The Buddha called this truth Anicca, impermanence. Look around you. The seasons shift. Flowers bloom, then wither. Your body, once small and new, grows older with each passing year. Joy rises and eventually fades. Sorrow grips the heart, then softens in time. Nothing lasts, not pleasure, not pain. Not even the thoughts swirling in your mind right now. And yet, we resist it. We cling to what feels good, hoping it will stay. We push away what hurts, hoping it will leave faster. And in that endless grasping and rejecting, we create suffering. It's not life itself that wounds us most deeply, it's our resistance to its natural flow. The job you cherished eventually changes. The relationship you relied on might shift or end. Your health, your youth, your possessions, none of it can be permanently secured. And yet we build our lives on these fragile foundations, pretending they'll last. When they don't, we feel betrayed. But life was never the betrayer. It was always teaching us impermanence. Imagine holding water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips through your fingers. But when you loosen your grip, you realize you can simply feel its coolness, its texture, its presence, without trying to trap it. Life is like that. It was never meant to be controlled, only experienced. In Buddhist teaching, understanding impermanence is the key to inner peace. Not because it makes pain disappear, but because it helps us stop clinging to what cannot stay. When you truly see that every moment, every emotion, every relationship is passing through like clouds across the sky, you learn to love without grasping, to succeed without ego, to endure loss without breaking. Let's be honest. Letting go isn't easy. We're wired to attach to people, to achievements, to identities. We tell ourselves stories. I am this job. I am this relationship. I am this body, this title, this image of who I must be. But each of these is a temporary costume, a role you play for a time, and clinging too tightly to them is like trying to hold a candle flame in your hand. It burns. True self-care, according to the Dharma, means loosening those grips. It means recognizing this too will pass, not in a fatalistic, indifferent way, but in a tender, accepting way. When joy visits your life, savor it, knowing it's a guest. When sorrow knocks, welcome it, knowing it too will leave. This is the secret doorway to peace. The Buddha often used the metaphor of a river. Life flows moment by moment, always changing. You can either stand in the current, clinging to a rock and exhausting yourself, or you can learn to float, carried by the water's natural course. Floating doesn't mean giving up. It means trusting the nature of life itself. It means grieving fully when loss comes, celebrating completely when blessings arrive, and holding neither too tightly. Because you understand, no state is final. And here's the beautiful part. The more you practice letting go, the more space you create inside. Space for peace, for resilience, for presence. When you stop clinging to one outcome, you open to the countless possibilities life might offer next. That disappointment you feared, it might lead to an unexpected freedom. That ending you resisted, it might become the gateway to something you never imagined. And you, exactly as you are, have the courage to meet impermanence with grace. It starts small, noticing how a thought arises and then fades, how a craving flares and then cools, how a storm of anger passes, leaving quiet in its wake. Each time you witness this natural ebb and flow, you loosen your grip on control and discover a peace you never knew was possible. There's a line from an old Zen saying, "Let go or be dragged." It sounds harsh, but it's profoundly kind, because the universe isn't punishing you when it changes. It's inviting you to dance with it, to learn the rhythm of rising and falling, of beginnings and endings, of holding and releasing. And in that dance, you find yourself more alive, more free, more at peace. So as you breathe now, perhaps place a hand on your chest, feel its rise and fall. A small reminder, even this breath comes and goes, and yet within it you are here, and that is enough. In our final chapter, we'll gather these threads together, exploring how Buddhist wisdom transforms self-care into not just a practice for survival, but for awakening. As we reach the close of this journey together, it's worth pausing to reflect on what we've uncovered. Self-care, not as a fleeting trend or indulgence, but as a profound path rooted in ancient Buddhist wisdom. This journey isn't simply about pampering the body or calming the mind. It's far richer than that. Self-care in the Dharma is an invitation to awaken to the truth of who we really are, beyond the masks and stories, to awaken to the unfolding reality of impermanence, of suffering, of compassion, and ultimately liberation. Every mindful breath, every moment of loving kindness, every step of letting go is a thread weaving the fabric of awakening. When you care for yourself deeply, you're not turning inward in isolation. You're reconnecting to the vast web of life, understanding that your well-being is intimately tied to the well-being of all beings. To care for yourself is to care for the world, and yet this path is never perfect. There will be moments of struggle, moments of doubt, moments when the old habits of clinging and aversion call us back. But with each return, with each fresh breath and renewed intention, we move closer to freedom. The journey of self-care is the journey of learning to be present with ourselves, exactly as we are. It is the journey of treating our own hearts with the same compassion we extend to others. It is the journey of embracing change, uncertainty, and imperfection with courage. And that, in itself, is a beautiful awakening. If this teaching has touched you, even just a little, consider this. How might your life change if you truly cared for yourself every day? Not out of selfishness, but out of wisdom and love. If you want to explore more teachings like these, to dive deeper into Buddhist wisdom, or to share your own journey, please join our community here. Subscribe, like, and share your thoughts below. Your presence and voice help this message reach others who need it most. Together we walk this path, learning, growing, awakening. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your openness. And may your path be filled with peace and gentle care.